Dear friends, welcome to Aboriginal Voices, where your voice matters. Today's podcast is brought to you by the Fair Use Disclaimer, where under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976 allows us fair use for the purposes of criticism, commenting, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. And with that, today's podcast is a piece written by Jonathan Shaw in the Harvard Magazine, dated November to December 2022, page 10, entitled Reparations for Slavery. So with that, let's begin. Should the United States pay reparations for slavery? Question mark. As controversial as that question is, the federal government, in fact, has a long history of providing compensation to people who have suffered harms of all kinds through no fault of their own, from people exposed to pesticides or nuclear radiation, to indigenous peoples, to farmers who've lost crops, to people harmed by vaccines or the closure of a factory or military base. These payments amount to billions of dollars every year to millions of Americans, says Moynihan, senior lecturer in public policy, Linda Biomes. And they're fairly routine. Biomes, former Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Commerce and Hauser Professor of the Practice of Nonprofit Organizations, Cornell Brooks of the Harvard Kennedy School, have been documenting the scope, administration, and funding mechanisms of what they term, quote, reparatory compensation, unquote. They found that no-fault programs to make people whole, whether they are for Christmas tree farmers, ginseng growers, or one of 100 different kinds of fishermen, number in the thousands. Reparations in the strict sense have also been paid in cases of official injustice, for instance, to Japanese Americans held in internment camps during World War II. Brooks, who once worked as a civil rights attorney in the Department of Justice, recalls that in his building there were government attorneys assisting the effort to provide reparations for victims of the Holocaust. But there was never any discussion of reparations for slavery. Did you hear that? So they had government attorneys who were assisting in the effort to provide reparations for victims of the Holocaust, but there were never any discussion of reparations for slavery. Now, if you just heard what I just repeated there, that is telling, but we're going to continue. Aiding the pair in their effort to catalog such government compensation programs were the leaders of the Black Students Associations at both HKS and the law school, and two other students. As Biomes turned up programs for sardine fishermen, clam fishermen, coal miners, descendants of veterans, and countless others, she didn't initially understand why the students, quote, were not as delighted by all these things we were uncovering. Until I realized that this was actually extremely painful for them, she says, to see that there were programs for everyone but them. Now, did you hear that? I hope you did. But just in case you didn't, I'm going to repeat that. She says, until I realized that this was actually extremely painful for them to see that there were programs for everyone but them. Essentially, the government had figured out all kinds of reparatory mechanisms, programmatically and financially, for everyone else. In this context, the lack of reparations for slavery seems a striking omission. Let me repeat that again. In this context, the lack of reparations for slavery seems a striking omission. So when the subject arises, says Brooks, former president and CEO of the NAACP, three fundamental objections are typically raised. One, that slavery took place too long ago to be able to trace its harms into the present. Well, we know that that's a lie. Two, that paying such reparations would be too expensive. And we know that too is a lie when you continuously exercise financial and other resources to countries like Ukraine. You give them to illegal immigrants crossing over to American soil. You even give them to non-citizens like the Pakistans or the Afghanis. So you've used up all your excuses, and all of them are false. But I digress. The third one is, and it would take administratively impossible to execute. Well, we know that too is a lie when you've done it for everyone else. And we continuously, as foundational Black Americans, we continuously see you handing out our money to everyone else. But I digress. Belying the first objection that the victims are no longer living, Biomes and Brooks point to an analogous and related event that is instructive to consider: the connected intergenerational harms caused by the implementation of the GI Bill from 1944 through 1955. Well, the bill provided veterans with guaranteed home loans, money for college or trade school training, and unemployment compensation. The 1.8 million eligible foundational Black American veterans were not explicitly excluded by the federal legislations, but at the insistence of congressmen from Jim Crow states, implementation was left to the states, and widespread discrimination and racism, like always, particularly in the South, where 79% of Black veterans lived, prevented most from taking advantage of the program. This has happened far too many times. But I digress. Even in New York and New Jersey, Biomes and Brooks report the 67,000 mortgages guaranteed by the legislation included fewer than 100 granted to non-whites because of discrimination by lenders. In Mississippi, just 2 such loans were made to Black veterans. Nearly 8 million veterans in total took advantage of the bill's education benefits. Most foundational Black American veterans who did so were sent to one of the tiny and underfunded historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs. Quote, that meant that there were fewer Black doctors, architects, and engineers, unquote, says Brooks, because among the HBCUs, there were virtually no schools of engineering, no schools of medicine, and Blacks were likewise excluded from trade schools and prevented from learning skills that would have enabled them to become plumbers or electricians. The point being, Brooks continues, that the GI Bill operated in an ecosystem of racism linked all the way back to slavery. And because the education and home ownership opportunities provided by the bill underlay the creation of intergenerational wealth, the harms to black veterans who did not receive benefits, quote, accumulate and they compound, he says, harming children, grandchildren, great grandchildren, and so on. The effects of redlining, predatory lending, depreciating house prices, and impaired economic viability of communities all contribute in tangible, empirically demonstrable ways to the racial wealth gap. Any fair housing lawyer will tell you those are some of the easiest ones to calculate. Recent legislation, the Sergeant Isaac Woodard and Sergeant Joseph Maddox GI Bill Repair Act, would allow surviving spouses and some direct descendants of black World War II veterans denied benefits under the original GI Bill to access home loans and educational assistance through existing programs. Let me pause for a minute. This is why we need our reparations, because we shouldn't have to be getting any loans for any houses. You know, foundational black Americans, our ancestors who were slaves to this country, who built up this country to make you a wealthy individual, for you to even have a voice out there talking down to us. You have a lot of nerve. We are owed reparations more than anyone. And all the benefits that you've been enjoying, we deserve it, and some. But I digress. Biome says that the research shows that the government really uses a range of financial techniques and tools and mechanisms to pay for these reparatory compensations, a combination of excess taxes, special assessments, trust funds, and subsidized insurance in the realm of insurance. The familiar example is that the FDIC insures bank deposits to $250,000 per account. The government also subsidizes no-fault flood insurance and agricultural insurance of many different kinds. Now see, that doesn't apply to us. But anyways, beyond these insurance mechanisms, she continues, there are dozens of different kinds of funding mechanisms, and there are precedents for intergenerational compensation. And that's what we need to be looking into also. For instance, hundreds of thousands of people and their children and grandchildren who were exposed to nuclear radiation in 12 Western states during Cold War weapons testing during 1945 and 1960 are covered by a cluster of different programs that recognize different groups and categories of harm. Those programs began in the late 1990s after 50 years of citizen advocacy and have paid out $25 billion. President Clinton's executive order, let me repeat that, President Clinton's executive order, one more time, President Clinton's executive order, when they say they can't do things, President Clinton's executive order establishing the programs conveys their spirit. Quote, while the nation can never fully repay these workers or their families, they deserve recognition and compensation for their sacrifices, unquote. Now, although Biomes and Brooks' research project focused only on federal compensation, there are state-level programs too, and other entities, including a number of universities, have been reckoning with their connections to slavery. Georgetown, for example, has allocated $400,000 a year to reparations that will benefit the descendants of slaves sold by the school in 1838 to secure its finances. Ain't that something? The Princeton Theological Seminary has set aside $27.6 million to fund $1 million annual reparations effort. And Harvard's report on its connections to slavery allocates $100 million for future actions, though it doesn't embrace reparations. Now that part, I found that stunning. But anyways, the data that Biomes and Brooks have gathered demonstrate that existing reparatory compensation programs are manageable and commonplace. Did you hear that, family? The data that Biomes and Brooks have gathered demonstrate that existing reparatory compensation programs are manageable and commonplace. They hope that their research will influence the debate over reparations for slavery. Quote, in our paper, says Brooks, we essentially say if reparatory compensation is routine and normal, why would we consider reparations to be aberrational and exceptional? I hope this project popularizes the notion that we can afford it, he continues. We can do this, and that the harm was not too long ago. America is skilled in reparations. So in closing, I'd like to include that foundational Black Americans who have been denied reparations for over 467 years are entitled to reparations, cash payments in the form of a check or cash, land included, gold and silver as well. We shouldn't be talking about education because education is included for all. All people don't deserve these reparations. Everyone else, as a matter of fact, have gotten reparations except for foundational Black Americans. We don't need any more educational benefits of any sort, especially when it's proven that it hasn't improved our lives over this course of time. We want our cash payments, cut the check. We want our land, and we want gold and silver, something that is going to be tangible and useful for us for generational wealth. I conclude with thank you for listening to my podcast. Please leave a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed, subscribe to the channel. This story, again, was taken from a hit piece by Jonathan Shaw out of the Harvard Magazine, dated November to December 2022. On page 10, on inside of the magazine, you'll find this story under Compensation Compendium, titled Reparations for Slavery, with a question mark. You're long overdue. This is Aboriginal Voices, where your voice matters. Please leave a comment in the comment section. Again, your voice matters here at Aboriginal Voices.